Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
We're having luck, but other sightings apparently were taken more seriously.
And one in particular, an incident called the Rendlesham Forest Incident, also known as Britain's Roswell. This was in 1980, shortly after Christmas, when a few American airmen who were stationed in the UK reported seeing a UFO.
A huge, solid, diamond-shaped object they described as 100 foot long, hovering silently in the sky above them.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
American public and global public finally understands UFOs are real. This is a technology that is so far beyond anything that we have.
Reportedly appear to exhibit unusual flight characteristics, appear to demonstrate advanced technology.
Arrow is the culmination of decades of DoD, intelligence community, and congressionally directed efforts to successfully resolve UAP encountered first and foremost by U.S. military.
Welcome back to Disclosure Team with me, your host, Vinny Adams. The following is an interview with Nick Cook. Nick is a former defense journalist with Jane's Defense Weekly, and in 2001, he released his book, The Hunt for Zero Point. In this interview, we discuss his new book, The Light Beyond the Mountains, and we touch upon some of his old work as well. If you enjoy this content, please take a second just to hit that like button, subscribe if you don't already, comment down below, or share it with your friends. I really appreciate the ongoing support. I hope you enjoy this interview with Nick Cook. So Nick, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm extremely well, thank you, Vinny. How are you?
Yeah, not bad at all, thank you.
Good.
So Nick, obviously you've got this new book that's serialized on Substack. I think you've released 2 chapters so far, which I'd love to dig into with you. But I thought initially we could kind of look back at some of your previous work to kind of get people who may not be as familiar with you, sort of an idea of where you've come from. So if you don't mind just kind of giving us a brief outline of your life, let's say from university leading up to sort of where you are now.
Okay, gosh, I've never been asked to go back to university before, which is probably a good thing. But I did an Arabic and Islamic studies degree at university, actually,
Wow.
which has nothing or had nothing to do with what I went on to do, which was journalism and defense journalism. Although you could say, I suppose, that, Middle East politics, sadly being what they are, that the Arabic sort of always came in handy. I did travel a bit in the Middle East as a journalist. But I left university not really knowing what to do. I mean, I had this language degree, but I'd always been fascinated by aviation and technology. So I went into, once I'd figured out what I did want to do, which was write about it, I then targeted a number of trade magazines relentlessly. And finally, after about 9 months after leaving uni, I got a kind of foot in the door with a very old, established aviation magazine called Interavia, which was based in Switzerland and was a sort of classic trade magazine. It published in 4 languages, and it had a sister journal, which was a defense magazine. But honestly, it couldn't have been better training for what I sort of went on to do. It was about really nuts and bolts kind of reporting on the grassroots of the aerospace industry upwards. So I literally went to press conferences to begin with on, widgets, and those were, bless the people who were trying to promote these things, were the most exciting things on the planet, and I had to pretend they were the most exciting things on the planet. But it was great training for what I went on to do.
That's interesting, because I had quite an interest in aircraft and that growing up. My dad worked for Rolls-Royce for the industrial marine turbine engines, so on all the ships and planes. I did my work experience there as a teenager and sort of had a big passion for it. So yeah, that's interesting.
Which bit of Rolls was that?
He worked in a few different areas. So he was based near Coventry in the Midlands,
Okay.
and that's
Anstey?
It was Anstey, yeah.
Anstey. Yeah.
So don't think he's there anymore.
I don't think so. I haven't obviously been in that world for a while, but I used to be big time, so I know it well. Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, I mean, during the aviation years that you were working on all this, I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the UFO subject was very much taboo and there was a lot of sort of stigma around it. But did it ever crop up in conversation?
So I did my sort of apprenticeship on this journal, Interavia, for about 3 years. And I can honestly tell you, in all of that time, never, ever came up once. Not helped perhaps by the fact I didn't have an interest in it. It just completely was not on my radar screen at all. I then moved to Jane's Defense Weekly in 1986. And I became the aviation editor there, I think a year later, 87. And now Jane's having a sort of more well-known name in the field. It used to get people ringing in or writing in saying, I've just seen something extraordinary hovering above the bottom of my garden. Can one of your experts tell us what it is? And sometimes there'd be photographs, and they were classic UFO photographs, or most of them were. I mean, some of them were obviously misidentifications of prosaic things, but there were some classic UFO shots. Now, to my shame, to begin with, I did not pay them any attention. They went on the bizarre pile. But we might drift onto this in a moment, but we could also address it now. When I got to the early 90s, when I was at Jane's, I realized I had, through this publishing organization, which, to those who don't know it, it was an incredibly famous name within the aerospace, defense, naval communities. Jane's Fighting Ships is a volume that used to get published every year. It had contained all the ships in the world. If you wanted to, there was apparently no ship in the Royal Navy that did not go to sail with this thing on its bridge. It was that sort of key. Right. And so within the military itself, Jane's had a fantastic name. And I realized that I could use this to my advantage. And the question that kept coming into my mind in the early 90s was, well, what could be the most sort of secret thing that particularly the US could possibly have developed? And the reason it entered my thinking was because in the mid to late 80s, early 90s, we as a publication, and I worked for a part of Jane's called Jane's Defense Weekly, we as a publication had become quite fixated on emerging stories about black world aircraft, so top secret classified platforms, like, as we later found out, the F-117A stealth fighter. There was a thing that we chased, a colleague of mine and I chased, called Aurora, which was meant to be a very high-flying, very fast sort of reconnaissance aircraft to replace the SR-71 Blackbird. So we were chasing these literal shadows, which were these classified aircraft. And in doing so, that sort of opened the apertures of my brain a bit to think, well, okay, well, this stuff has been revealed, and the stealth fighter was formally revealed in 1988, having been flying in squadron strength for 5 years in secrecy. Aurora never revealed itself, but there was pretty good evidence that there was something there. We can talk about that maybe a bit later. And I just thought, okay, well, if you're burying this stuff away, and actually, stealth being invisible effectively to radar is an important breakthrough, but what about a real breakthrough? What if there was a propulsion physics breakthrough? What if there was a massive, energy breakthrough? Well, if you're going to squirrel stealth away in the way that you've done, what on earth are you going to do with something that is, perhaps is as big a breakthrough in physics terms as the bomb had been, the atom bomb in 1945. So that was the way my sort of brain was thinking. And then in the early 90s, I can't remember the exact date, saying around 92 maybe, somebody plonked a magazine article on my desk, which was this thing. The title of it was, and it was just a photocopy. I didn't even know what magazine it came from. It said the G engines are coming. Why did they put this article on my desk? Because by now I had started to acquire a bit of a reputation within the organization for, if it's too difficult, give it to that Cook bloke, because he'll take on the kind of some of the more bizarre stuff, like the stealth black world planes. And that sort of blurred slightly into the UFO field a bit.
Yeah.
So this article about the G engines then set me off on a trail of evidence, which I later turned into a book called The Hunt for Zero Point. After about 7 or 8 years of sort of digging and being on that trail, I suddenly realized I had enough data to put into a book. That's not how it started. I was literally acquiring this knowledge for my own benefit, my own curiosity. But then I suddenly realized, there's a book in this. And I had previously written books. I'd written novels. So the book world wasn't that unfamiliar to me. But anyway, the book, The Hunt for Zero Point, came out in 2001. So it's a way back now.
Yeah, and that also led you into this documentary in 2005, UFOs, The Secret Evidence, where you obviously travel around exploring different sort of avenues and potentials of, finding this propulsion system. But what prompted you to explore the connection between sort of gravity control technology and Nazi Germany? Is that something that you like?
Well, I did it very reluctantly, to be absolutely honest. And as I say in the book, my beat professionally was contemporary modern aerospace. That had led me into, I'd been into the skunk works. I'd interviewed top officials there. That was quite a familiar space to me. And I was relatively, I was comfortable there. Yeah. But at a point in this investigation in The Hunt for Zero Point, I kept being confronted with, it was sort of like a kind of mythology that kept on surfacing about, well, if you're going to look at, exotic propulsion, you better look at what the Nazis were doing. And I'm going, I don't need to look at the Nazis. I don't want to look at the Nazis. It's not my beat. I just want to stay on my familiar NASA and slightly less familiar, sort of black world kind of trail, talking to, industry, military, whatever. But I realized I just couldn't ignore it. I had to, if I was going to do any due diligence on the backstory, then I had to go and have a look at what the Nazis had been doing, or at the very least, what this legend, this sort of mythology about, Nazi flying saucers said. And so, and I did it the only way I knew how, which was both to go on the ground, so to speak. So I went to Germany and followed up various leads, but I also looked in the archives, and of course I started there. And I remember, one of the things that I followed up first was the reports about Foo Fighters, Foo Fighters at the end of the Second World War. So 1944, 45, balls of light in the sky, often small metallic spheres. I mean, we're quite familiar with that story now.
Indeed.
But at the time, this was seen very much as a historical thing. This was particularly, it started in World War II, where there were many sightings. These things used to appear in, formations, more or less, in amongst Allied bomber streams and so forth. So I remember digging into a file that hadn't really been investigated much, if at all, by the time I came across it, in the American archives at Bolling Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. And the project file was called Lusty, and it was an American intelligence file on Lusty was an acronym for Luftwaffe Secret Technology. And these were raw reports from the field by intelligence agents as they came in. So they hadn't been filtered that much, to give them any kind of wash or spin. And what was interesting about them was you could really see in these reports that these intelligence operatives in the field were chasing these stories up about Foo Fighters. What we need to find the obviously very secret entities and organizations that the Nazis were operating that built these things that entered our Allied bomber streams and mystified our pilots and aircrew. So it was apparent that they considered it a real thing. And of course, they thought it was a threat. They thought these things were weapon systems that possibly could explode in a bomber stream, take out bombers or whatever. Of course, we know that never happened. If they had whatever role they seemed to have or had was more a sort of observation role. It was a reconnaissance role. It was apparently, insofar as you could tell, getting into these formations, these Allied formations of aircraft, to try and discern what they were, perhaps. That's how it appeared. Anyway, suffice to say, after quite a long time digging, going in all kinds of different directions, I found a lot of wispy sort of circumstantial evidence that the Germans had a flying saucer program. They certainly had some very exotic technology on the books. But I never found a smoking gun that, led me to a facility or information on the facility that you could hang your hat on and go, yeah, they actually built a real flying saucer. It worked, and they were responsible for all of these sightings. No, it sadly never happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I did have a very interesting time, obviously, following all of this stuff up. And it took me into some other leads in the whole sort of Nazi German landscape, which perhaps we can talk about.
Yeah, I find it really interesting because I know a couple of other researchers who have done great work looking into Foo Fighters. We've got Graham Rendell here in the UK as well. And, cross-referencing them with, like you say, using American documents with the British archives. And, these things were happening in many countries, Poland, Italy, and all over. So it really does. It's interesting. But, it's funny how these myths with the Nazis perpetuate, and just over time, so many people believe in these Antarctica stories of these secret bases with flying saucers. Yet there's never been really a shred of evidence to suggest that it's real.
No, yet it is really tantalizing. It's like, I often used to say to myself, it's a little bit like looking through a glass darkly. It's like the evidence should be there because it keeps coming back at you. And it's obviously contained in, as I said, those Allied intelligence reports. They at the time believed this, but yet in a weird smoke and mirrors-y kind of way, the closer you get to the evidence trail, the more it becomes elusive and evaporates. So it has a strange quality about it, which perhaps, again, we might return to later on, because I have a few thoughts and feelings on it all in the light of what I now know. But we're talking now about 25 years ago. So yeah. I was looking at the world in a very different way from how I see it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Understandable. I mean, something that's obviously came out last year with David Grush's revelations of crash retrievals and legacy programs. I was rewatching your 2005 documentary, and you met up with Colonel John Alexander, who, when asked if he believes the US is in possession, he sort of gave an emphatic no. He doesn't believe that they've recovered any craft. And now I sort of seem to remember that he's recently changed his tune on that. I mean, does that make sense to you? Or do you think he may have known back then and he was just kind of, not able to talk about it?
I can't really speak for John. I mean,
sure.
I can speak for that interview that we did. And I think he was genuine. I think he was sincere. Absolutely. Right. He was sincere when he said it, that he didn't believe that we had recovered, technology, non-human intelligence based technology. And I know that he has said some different things more recently. I'm not quite sure what they are, to be honest, which is why I don't want to speak for him. And I wouldn't anyway. But I think a lot of us, Vinny, have revised our opinions. I mean, I was in 2005 when I did that documentary for the History Channel. I was very firmly looking at it from a nuts and bolts perspective. So in other words, what could have been built by us humans, that looked like a UFO. I wasn't really looking at I wasn't looking at it through the possibility so much that this stuff had crashed and we'd retrieved it. I mean, I was aware of the stories, of course, then, the Roswell was very familiar to me by then, as it was to many people, but that was the way I was looking at it all. And there was a particular aspect to that commission by Channel 4, which was my role was, in a way, was to try and sort the wheat out from the chaff in a sort of disinformation context, which was, so it sort of posed the question, are UFOs merely a smokescreen for real world technology, of the likes of the U-2 program in the 50s, the A-12 SR-71 in the 60s, et cetera, et cetera. Those were real CIA spy planes. Yeah. And the CIA admitted, I think it admitted round about the time we made the documentary, that it had deliberately used the UFO stories to obfuscate what it was up to. The implication being, you don't want to report that, sir, because if you see something glint high in the sky and it might be one of them, they're UFOs, and we're going to look at you a little bit funnily in a sort of circumspect way, which of course was perfect cover, and variations on that have provided brilliant cover for secret stuff. I mean, by then, 2005 or 2004, when we made the documentary, it was not my view any longer that this was merely a nuts and bolts phenomenon. It was patently clear from reviewing the data that this was a much more complex story than, it merely being about top secret technology. I mean, I got to the end of The Hunt for Zero Point. Spoiler alert, if anyone hasn't read it and wants to. That again, this had been a truly fascinating journey, and it had taken me to some incredible places, but I could not definitively hang a hat on a piece of evidence that said that the US had developed and deployed anti-gravity technology. I did find some really, really interesting programs, but that's what emerged from that story, that book. By 2005, I mean, it's quite an interesting little sort of side story here, in that this is making the Channel 4 History Channel documentary in 2004-5, in that we were under, as the makers of this film, some pressure by Channel 4, which was one of the partners, to definitively say the whole UFO phenomenon is just a sort of man-made cover-up exercise. You know,
Sure.
That's
Yeah.
what it is. And I had to fight quite hard for a small bit, I think it's at the end of the film, that says, you know, what I've tried to do here is try to explain away sightings that have directly impacted my frame of reference, which is, you know, aerospace editor of a defense magazine that has spent a long time looking into secret stuff. But I can safely say, whilst that happened, it does not explain the whole phenomenon. There is clearly a body of evidence which is, you know, is way bigger than this story. But, you know, I'm going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, folks. And you know, but it was interesting, you know, that and that wasn't for sinister reasons. It wasn't because, you know, somebody had lent on them to go, this is what you got to say, Channel 4. It was simply that TV loves to take a very firm editorial line on something, and they wanted me to say, they wanted the program to say that this was a all man-made hoo-ha, but it clearly isn't.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a fascinating film, and I'm going to pop a link in the description of the video here just so people can go and check it out for themselves. So let's talk about...
Can I just say so? Sorry, Vinny. Just before we leave that, actually, there's another film that I did before that. I think it came out in 1999, and it's called $1 Billion Secret, and that was I think that was Channel 5 and the Learning Channel at the time. That was another 2-hour doc, and it also explored but more definitively in a way, explored the dividing line between classified aircraft programs and UFOs. But it was actually done by a really fabulous veteran film director, a chap called Mike Grigsby, who kind of came out of it was called the Granada School of Television Making. He'd, I think, you know, he'd done time with amazing film directors like Alan Parker. You know, these guys came out of a school in the 50s and 60s. And Mike did this. I mean, it's a beautiful looking documentary. And it really does explore that fine line and the sort of slight mystical line between UFOs and secret aircraft tech. And I remember at one point, our researcher took us into the San Luis Valley in Colorado. And I don't know whether you're sort of familiar with all of the things that have been going on there. But there's a chap, UFO investigator there, who's quite well known, called Christopher O'Brien. And Christopher had done a lot of good work probing, you know, a lot of the really strange stories that had cropped up there. And I remember in that doc, I'd spend about 3 or 4 days in the San Luis Valley and talking to people about, I mean, some really extraordinary stories. And, you know, bear in mind, I was a dyed-in-the-wool, you know, nuts and bolts hack.
Sure.
It was all really, this was unbelievably new territory for me. And then I had to get on a plane after I'd done 4 days of this stuff, you know, hanging out with Chris O'Brien and talking to ranchers who'd had cows mutilated and flying saucers over their backyards. And I mean, it was all happening. I then had to fly to Washington to go and interview a guy called General George Mullner in the Pentagon. And you can see all this in the doc. George Mullner had been head of US Air Force Research and Development. So, and the topic of the conversation, which had taken me a long time to broker, was black world technology, classified stuff. That was on the agenda to talk about. Right. So I go in there with a film crew and we start talking. He's sadly he's died, George Mulner. He's a very nice guy. And he was probably as open as he could be about Black World stuff. And I remember asking him, I said, I've just come from this place in Colorado where ranchers are reporting, stuff flying silently over their heads, hovering there. It's like a sort of UFO theme park. And, I want you to tell me, General, that these aren't yours. Should we believe that this is some kind of Air Force stuff that we don't know about that's way beyond my frame of reference? And he said, it's not ours. And then he sort of smiled and laughed. He said, I'd love to put them under contract, though, because whoever's doing it, I'd love that stuff. Now, is that him being disingenuous, or is that him being genuine? He looked genuinely baffled to me, insofar as you can tell.
Yeah.
But we did go on to talk about some, other real Black World stuff, including the mythical Aurora Mark V spy plane. And he was a bit more forthcoming about that, which was quite interesting. But it was, it was. I just wanted to alert everyone to this other doc called $1 Billion Secret, which I think is still out there somewhere. You can certainly see it on YouTube.
Yeah, I will. I'll pop a link for that in if I can find it as well. Absolutely. So the new book, The Light Beyond the Mountains, that you're serializing on Substack, does it relate to the Hunt for Zero Point in any way at all?
Well, I really say it doesn't, because it comes from a completely different standpoint, actually. I mean, I'm a writer. I've written 25 books or something. I mean, not all under my own name, because I ghostwrite as well.
Sure.
But, I do a lot of different things. So for me, The Light Beyond the Mountains is a clean break from the Hunt for Zero Point, because it is looking at a totally different thing. And I explain this. Obviously, as you said, Vinny, I'm serializing it on Substack. The chapters come out every fortnight, and that is a paid subscription thing. But in the middle, I put other stuff up which relates to what I'm talking about. So it's sort of discursive. It's meant to be interactive, actually, and I'm inviting a conversation with people, because consciousness clearly affects us all. It's, not everyone, even though we like to think that everyone is interested in UFOs, not everyone is. But what binds us all is our conscious experience of ourselves, life, reality, whatever. So, as I say, the chapters come out every fortnight. There's sort of filler material that is free to read and view. I post podcasts with the people who've appeared on the journey with me. And it is a journey. I mean, that's a format I'm quite comfortable with. And there's a sort of slightly shameless nod in the cover art, which is done by a fabulous guy. I don't know if you know him, called Tristan Maduro, who is on Twitter X's Deep Fry guy. And Tristan came up with this fabulous artwork, which doesn't look unlike something from Lord of the Rings, because it does feel rather like, that sort of a journey. There is an unknown aspect to the hinterland ahead. But as I say in the introduction, this is a hopeful book. The Light Beyond the Mountains of the title is intentional in a number of ways. It pays heed to, it is a nod to the thing that kicks the story off, which is in 1992, I was hanging out outside Area 51, as you do. And I was with a colleague, a chap called Guy Norris. He's currently technology aerospace editor-chief of Aviation Week. But back then, we used to work at James together. He then went off to join a magazine called Flight, and he was based in North America. So we went on this 10-day tour of kind of the secret American hinterland of Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. So we did this thing, and we stopped off for a couple of days outside Area 51 where we camped, and I relate that in the prologue of the book. Yeah. The second time we were there, I saw something I couldn't explain. I mean, you know, I'm trained. I had been trained to dig into, you know, stuff that I couldn't recognize, but this thing that I saw rising above the hills from behind the hills that protected Area 51 from prying eyes was this orb. It was a golden, brilliant orange sun. And Guy and I looked at it and we kind of went, oh, that's not something you see every day of the week. And it sort of drifted lazily off downrange and then disappeared. So that is, in sort of classic storytelling terms, that is the inciting incident of this book. I ignored it for 3 decades, 2.5 decades. I didn't really even think about it that much. But then when the New York Times did its story, seminal story in 2017 about ATIP and secret Pentagon units studying UFOs for, you know, longer than anyone, well, actually in secret, you know, when it professed publicly not to have any interest in it, that sort of rekindled my interest, as it did for a lot of people. And I made a few calls to, you know, people I'd known years ago, and I said, is this for real? You know, is what the New York Times reporting on the money? And they went, yeah, you know, largely, yes, there are a few details that aren't right, but it's really on the money. And that made me think again about my sighting in 1992. But by then too, I'd started out on a consciousness journey. And we can get into that if you like. But, you know, by now I was coming, that was my interest. You know, my interest was in consciousness. It wasn't really in UFOs, but as I explain in the introduction to the book, which is a sort of 6,000 word manifesto that Substack likes you to sort of lay out before you get writing to let people know what they're in for. I mean, in that I say I had tried to pitch through my agent to publishers a book about consciousness, and they basically came back and went, well, why the hell should we read a book on consciousness by you? You're not an expert in consciousness. And I went, well, we don't want to be too glib here, but actually no one is, or everyone is, depending on your view, because It's something that affects us all. And they went, yeah, well, try harder. So I said, okay, well, look, what if I were to, you know, my expertise is in aerospace and defense. You know, if you want expertise, that's what I have. So what if I were to come back into this consciousness subject through the UFO portal? At least then I've got some credentials. And they went, yeah, okay, right, give that a go. So I redrafted the proposal. I submitted it again. Again, you can read about this in the introduction. And they basically went, nah, that's not working for us either, because now we don't know whether it's about UFOs, whether it's about consciousness, or whether it's about something else. And I'm going, you know, sort of tearing my hair out. And they, so I go, finally I go, look, okay, all right. I get it. I've allowed the proposal for this book to be bent out of true by lots of professional opinion I've been listening to and I respect, but actually I should just write the book I want to write. And so I told my agent to take it off the market, and I was going to do it on Substack, where I don't get, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love editors. Good ones are fantastic. They'll really shape a book into what it's meant to be. But there is a freedom in writing fortnightly on a platform that allows you to do that. It's a bit scary too, as I say, because I'm a very sort of quite, you know, I'm quite disciplined about chiseling away at all my words, but I have to ensure every fortnight that there's something comes out. The show has to go on. So that aspect is a little unsettling, but so far actually very enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when it comes to the consciousness and the research you've been doing, I mean, personally myself, and I've not looked probably as hard as a lot of people, but there doesn't seem to be much in the scientific and academic community that really hones in on consciousness. Like, it hasn't been touched very well. Like, almost there's people don't want to go that far. Have you come across that, or has there been some good science been done into consciousness?
I mean, of course, yeah, there's actually lots of good science has been done on consciousness. I think the issue is that because no one knows what consciousness, where it comes from. That's the issue. I mean, we know kind of what consciousness is. It gives us, our experience of everyday reality. It makes us self-aware. We are aware that we are conscious. It is our window onto the reality that we perceive. But the issue is we don't know where it comes from. So all the really good sort of mainstream science stuff has been done on the materialist reductionist side of it, which says that all consciousness is generated from within inside the brain, or our nervous system. That is where it comes from. But there is, of course, another school of thought. I mean, I like to call it an emerging school of science thought,
right? Because
it is, that says, well, actually, the brain looks much more like a sort of transmitter-receiver, a transceiver that broadcasts and receives, and that somehow we download our conscious experience from something that is embedded in the universe. Now, back in, 15 years ago, I had no conception of any of this. I had none at all. I knew the first time I was really introduced to the whole idea of this, or the debate and discussion around it, was, and I can't remember whether I say this in the Substack. I think I do say it in the Substack intro. My wife had what's called a shared death experience when her mum died. That was in 2014, so 10 years ago exactly, or nearly exactly. I was in the room. It was, as anyone will know, who's had the misfortune to go through it, when a loved one dies, it's very distressing. But I was sort of standing back. My wife was holding her mum's hand, and at the moment her mum actually died, my wife stood up in the room, and to everyone's, well, my surprise particularly, but everyone's surprise, she went, "It's all right, she's fine." And I'm looking at the girl I've been married to for 25 years or 20 years, whatever it was at that point. And I thought, no, the world's there. It's not all right. Your mum has just died. I mean, literally at this precise second. I know it's distressing, and you're distressed and upset, and we all are, but it's not all right. So what's going on? So sometime later, I said to her, what was that all about? And she went, well, you were there too. And I went, where? And she said, well, I was in this place. It was timeless, infinite, connected. I knew everything. It felt more real than this place, the physical 3D, 4D world that we inhabit. It was really real, and I knew everything. But what was frustrating was I couldn't bring that knowledge back. But basically, I knew the secret of the universe, the world. I knew why we're here. I knew it all, but I can't bring it back. And I went, okay, I've got to look into this. I mean, I'm the reporter training in me kicks in. I go, I've got to know what this is. So I did a bit of Googling, and I went, oh my God, this is a thing. This is called a shared death experience. Other people have had this experience, and people have written about it. And okay, so by this point I'm invested, and I go, well, I've got to follow this up. So I did follow it up. I became really interested in the whole consciousness thing. And I did a lot of work on it. And to the degree that I then wanted, of course, what happens when, writers do lots of research, is they then want to go write about it. So I wanted to write a book about this, but I sort of realized then, in a way that I didn't quite realize now, that no publisher was going to want to, publish me on this. I mean, they might if I were a psychologist or whatever, neuroscientist, like, Eben Alexander, who's had, and his near-death experience. But so I knew I couldn't do that. So I did the next best thing, which I wrote a thriller about it. I took that substrate, the whole consciousness thing, and I turned it into a thriller, which became published as by Penguin. It's called The Grid. And but I took it to as close to the wire, the plot that was and the story, as I felt I could, in a sort of real world setting. In that everything I was writing about, I felt had a kind of verisimilitude. I believed that a plot, or rather a reality around the plot I'd been writing, could exist, which talked about a kind of AI that knew everything. It was an all-seeing all-seeing AI, because it was plugged into the information substrate that is the base, line existence, as far as we can tell, of the physical universe and beyond. So that took me up to 2019. I then got a really lucky break just before we went into lockdown, where a philanthropist funded me to study consciousness for year and a half, 2 years. I mean, fully funded me to do it. And so I did nothing, particularly during lockdown, there wasn't a whole heap else to be able to do. So I was very fortunate in that I could really get into it. Sure. I interviewed a lot of people about the subject. And then I was left with a sort of a kind of dead end, which was, well, that was interesting. What do I do with it? Because the philanthropist just said, I don't care what you do with it. Just come back and tell me what you found out after every 3 months or something. But then, in the weird way that these things unfold, Robert Bigelow, who will be familiar to you and many viewers, launched a competition to kick off his new institute on consciousness, which is called the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies, BICS. And when he did that, which I think was either in 2020, I think, beginning of 2020, I realized I had enough data, to be able to answer the exam question, which he posed to everyone as a sort of kick-off event for this Consciousness Institute. It was an essay contest. The question was, what is the best available evidence for the survival of consciousness post-death? I entered the contest, didn't think I had a prayer of winning anything. I got a prize. I went to Las Vegas a year and a half later, pick up the prize. I was now in the very facility that I'd seen and heard about and known for years. This was Robert Bigelow's huge aerospace facility on the northern fringes of Las Vegas, wherein in the basement of said facility, there are meant to be crash-retrieved UFO artifacts and all kinds of swirling rumors, none of which, by the way, I ever saw. And I received my prize. And then 2 months later, I got a call from Bob Bigelow saying, did I want to be a part-time research director at his new institute? So I said, yep. And there I was. I mean, so that was my sort of consciousness journey. It's not the journey I describe in the book, which is different, but that's sort of where I was up to a year or two ago.
Wonderful, fascinating. And now that you kind of have been down the consciousness route, when you look at the UFO subject now, do you look at it through a different lens with that kind of consciousness aspect to it? Can you integrate that into the way that you perceive the UFO subject?
Totally. I mean, I totally integrate it. I mean, I don't totally understand it, obviously, who does?
Sure.
But yeah, it has made me see the whole UAP discussion in a different light. And as I said, a while back, and as I say in the introduction to this book, that's not really what I wanted to discuss in this book, but it does provide a portal of entry into the consciousness discussion, which is useful, actually, because you sort of need one, I think. And certainly in storytelling terms, I think you need a portal of entry, because it can just be it is just the most arcane subject. And of course it sounds dull on one level, because it's like, well, okay, sure, we all have a conscious experience of living and the world, but it's like, it's just there, like the sky is blue, why bother thinking about it? But it becomes much more interesting, I think, when you delve into aspects of it, which is like, so if consciousness gives us our waking and dreaming experience of reality, then how do we perceive the world? And is our perception of the world what is really out there? Or have we, in some sense, through consciousness, rendered it, in the way that software renders an image? Have we rendered it into something that suits us? It does for us, but actually there's so much more to it than we perceive. Now, if you go to people like Professor Donald Hoffman, who has done a lot of work on how we interface with reality, how we, the interface between what is really out there and what we perceive to be out there, you begin to understand, certainly I began to understand, through a very useful analogy that Hoffman portrays and paints, which is this one of, we perceive reality much as I am perceiving you now on the interface, on the graphical user interface of my computer. There are icons on my screen, which I click on, that go off and do useful things. That's how I navigate my computer. Of course, if I were to really navigate my computer through its squirrely software and electronics, I'd get nowhere, because I'm not a software or electronic specialist. But the icons give me just what I need and no more. And that's what Hoffman says about life. We sort of, metaphorically and figuratively, we click on the things that we need to experience reality. And, when we do, these clicks create conscious experiences. And, actually, if you want to go even further than that, those conscious experiences, which are information-based, feed back into the information substrate of the universe. And, and so it goes. So actually what we are beginning to do, it feels and seems, it is as if we are humans, actually anything in the physical reality substrate, is feeding information back into the universe itself, which I think one can begin to look at as a living, conscious AI computer, a little bit like the Matrix, but perhaps not as scary, in which all of this, everything is just a constant exchange of information. And in that exchange of information, the AI learns to evolve and grow. So we can only speculate. But
absolutely,
those models become quite interesting when you look at them, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing that I always find myself pondering over is, Are these UFO sightings simply a witness seeing an object in the sky, or is the object in your sky something else that has this ability to change the perception of the witness into seeing whatever it is they're seeing? I always ponder that. Is it a lot more harder to comprehend what that actually is happening in that interaction? Because it's been said that people have photographed objects, and then when it comes out, it's different to what they actually saw with their eyes. So many things that just swirl around my brain when trying to think about, how consciousness can either be affected by a non-human intelligence or a UFO. But then at the same time, do we have the ability, like these people that do CE5 and human-initiated contact, do we have the power to use our consciousness in reverse to affect a UFO, to bring it in and have an interaction? These are all things that I kind of think about.
Well, I think anyone who talks about CE5, close encounters of the fifth kind, wherein you put an intention out to see a UFO. I haven't looked into it that closely, but it seems as if there is some quite a lot of data around that. That seems to have an effect. So that's not just that, but there is much more evidence besides that suggests that this is a two-way interface.
Sure.
And that certainly our intentionality particularly can affect the outcome. It may not be scientific, it's not scientific in the way that quantum physics is, right, wherein a particle comes into existence when we observe it from a wave of potential until that point. But there is some pretty, I think, compelling, persuasive work to say that intentionality can affect physical machinery. Therefore, it affects our reality around us as well. So I think it's a two-way mechanism. I was fortunate enough to know Ingo Swann for a while. Ingo was the CIA's kind of foremost remote viewer. Obviously, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ were the sort of architects of the remote viewing program. This is back in the early 70s. But Ingo Swann was the sort of star remote viewer who helped them derive the protocols for remote viewing. And Ingo contacted me after The Hunt for Zero Point came out and said, would I meet and talk about it? And so I did, and then I got to know him, and I ended up writing his family asked me to write a biography of him, and I said, that's crazy. There's too much stuff that's been written about him already. But I did write these two manuscripts, or we found two manuscripts of Ingo's, which I sort of put into one volume, which came out as something called Resurrecting the Mysterious, again in 2019. But Ingo's sort of mantra was that we're all psychic. It's not just me, Ingo. We all have the ability. It just happens to be latent in us. Most people don't exercise it, but some people, do because they see it as a gift. But we all have it. And he always said, I can train you, Nick, to remote view. I could train anyone to remote view, more or less. And of course, we now have, work has been done by Gary Nolan and others, Dr. Gary Nolan, Professor Gary Nolan, to look at parts of the brain which may act as those sort of enabling mechanisms, to induce psychicness, to induce, to act as that bridge to the substrate. To me, it's clearly an interactive thing. It's not a one-way street. It's just that we as a species have become very shut down. Civilization has shut us down. I'm sure if you went back to our ancestors, and actually you need no look need look no further than indigenous wisdom to know
Sure.
that this is practiced, a lot still in certain parts of the world, except we civilized people have just lost that ability for the most part.
Yeah, and I've experienced that firsthand from speaking with indigenous people, especially in South America, that it's just everyday conversation to them. But, have you encountered, obviously coming from a nuts and bolts aviation history sort of background, to now completely opposite end of the spectrum with consciousness, and you must have encountered some stigma or something along the way, or some people questioning, well, why have you gone down this route? Is that something, or has it actually been okay?
No, it's been quite liberating, actually.
Oh, good.
I mean, I did encounter stigma when I wrote The Hunt for Zero Point 22, when it came out 23 years ago. And that was, a lot of that was just through colleagues just going, why are you writing about this? Why, you seem to be quite happy writing about, aerospace engineering and technology. Well, it was great. But that question, about is there something else? I mean, is that just the tip of the iceberg? I mean, that just wouldn't go away. Yeah. So, which led me into the research for The Hunt for Zero Point. But with this consciousness stuff, there is stigma around it, sure, but there would be stigma, I think, attached to anything that I was doing if I were a neuroscientist, or if I were a doctor, perhaps, or something to do with the medical or psychology profession. I mean, I've in my ghostwriting career, I've written books for a lot of people, and I wrote a book for quite a very famous psychiatrist, and I learned a lot about the workings of the human mind through that project. And I remember, and I might describe it even, I think, no, I don't describe it in The Light Beyond the Mountains, but I have described it. In fact, I described it in my BICS essay. So the essay that I wrote for Bigelow, how this psychiatrist used to go to psychiatry conventions where he would bring up the subject of out-of-body experience, which a lot of his patients had had. And he was almost laughed out of the room, or at least, there was a dreadful silence and you could hear a pin drop. It's like, no one talks about that stuff when you're in polite neuroscientific company. That just wasn't done. But he was a psychiatrist. What am I? I'm a journeyman investigator, curious researcher of the unknown, as I loftily say in the sort of the tag under my Rogue Icons Substack blog, and that's what I am. I'm just relentlessly curious, and I'm exploring this strange frontier. So I mean, that hasn't been an issue.
Fantastic. So, I mean, here we are, 2024. We've got The Light Beyond the Mountains coming out every couple of weeks. Where does Nick Cook go from there?
Well, there's a lot of writing to do, obviously. There's a lot of writing to do that's on that book. I mean, every 2 weeks, I mean, it probably won't be finished for a year and a half, so, I mean, that'll keep me busy. I do, I write fiction as well, so I'll have other books on the go as well. I do a bit of consulting work. So, I'm quite busy, touch wood. This is interesting, though. It's just a very fascinating field. And of course, there's a lot going on around it, as you know. Who would have guessed, maybe as little as 3 or 4 years ago, that there would be hearings on Capitol Hill during 2023 about UAP and the whole subject of non-human intelligence. Has the military had contact with non-human intelligence to the degree that it has crash retrieved artifacts squirreled away in its, basement somewhere, along with bodies and contact and all the rest of it. And, Congress men and women and senators of all stripes, both stripes, are looking at this really seriously. And, you have to pinch yourself sometimes and go, can this be happening? But it is.
It is indeed. Yeah, we're in almost uncharted territory, and it's exciting times for sure. But, well, listen, Nick, I appreciate you joining me today, and I wish you nothing but the best moving forward. So thank you very much.
Well, you too, Vinny. Thanks so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
Indeed. And to everyone watching, as always, thank you. Please take a second to like the video, subscribe if you don't, and join us for the next one. But for now, take care. Goodbye.